process management to me, it's not the destination, it's not even the journey, it's actually a vehicle that you can use to go places and do things, yeah, and it sort of allows you to explain how things work.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with process practitioners. Now, some of you, you're joining us for the first time, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you. We have a database of over 160 episodes at this point from various practitioners all throughout the world of business process management. So plenty of content for you to consume and digest. And for some of you, you've been with us for some time. Some of you would have been with us right from the beginning. So welcome back to our next episode. We'd really appreciate a rating and a review on the platform that you're viewing or listening to this at the moment. We're all about continue to educate the market around the value and the power of process. And giving us a rating and review is certainly going to help us to continue to spread that message. And in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Phil Short. Now, Phil is the owner and consultant at PJS Process and Systems Improvements. He is an IT guy that loves process. He spent most of his career working with a huge corporation, over 100,000 people, but spends a lot of his time now working with more small to medium-sized organization, and is also a digital advisor for the Canadian government to help do so. So has quite the experience across the board, from the very large to the very small. So Phil, very excited for this conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, no problem. Great to be here, and excited to share my knowledge and experience. Yeah, so I'm sure you've had some gurus on here before, so maybe I can add and build on what's gone before.
Absolutely. No, it's going to be good. So I know that we obviously caught up briefly before we got started today. And you were saying that you have a desire to write a book, and you've got a pretty good, clear idea as to what you want to capture in this book about what's the purpose of a process. I know you've done quite a bit of digging and researching around the history of it, but let's start there. What is the purpose of a process?
Well, it's a really good question, and it maybe the question is the purpose of process in general as opposed to a process. And so this is one of the questions that came up when I was actually working with Mars back along, trying to explain to people why I thought the process approach would actually make sense when I was doing big projects and stuff like that. And I got it, and a lot of the people that we talked to got the reason for it. But the executives and the decision makers sort of struggle sometimes to really sort of buy into it and whatever, and maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later in the conversation. So I actually started thinking about, I know why it's there, but how would I explain it to other people? And essentially, the reason we do business process management and many of the other sort of domains that are associated with it, it's really just to make things better. Yeah, like it's to understand how things work so that we can actually make them better and drive whatever goals and objectives an organization has. So I mean, to me, that's fundamentally what it's all about. It's a getting so that you can understand how things work, and then allow us to sort of rebuild it and redesign it to work better. So that in its essence, that's what it is. And like you said, I went back through history to kind of try to understand it a little more. And a lot of it's grounded in quality and, Schuhart back in the Bell Labs in the 20s and stuff, over 100 years ago now, I guess. But the fundamental principles haven't really changed. So really just to make things better.
No, that's good. That's good. And I guess one question that comes to mind when talking about making a process better is, because obviously, talking to anyone in any organization, you probably get a similar response as to, I'm flat out, I'm busy, there's a lot on my plate. And so the question is it worth it? Or another question is, what's the potential? What's possible? Because I think that for people that aren't familiar with the power of process, they're not always aware that this really complex and long and tedious process that you're currently participating in, it actually can be significantly better, significantly more efficient, and things like that. So how would you tackle that when someone's, I guess, being challenged with, is it worth it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, that is one of the challenges is, if you attack it from a let's do business process management point of view, then you struggle to justify exactly what it is and, what you're going to get return for, for the investment and the time and whatever, because everyone's busy, like we haven't got a lot of spare time to go doing this stuff. So what I've always done is tried to sort of, explain, what are the benefits of actually making things better? And then, okay, here's a way to do it. Here's a vehicle. And I talk about, the process management to me, it's not the destination. It's not even the journey. It's actually a vehicle that you can use to go places and do things. Yeah. And it sort of allows you to, really to explain how things work and, and then, break it down and then apply the right technology at the right time and, sort of find out whether it's quite often not the boxes and arrows that are wrong. It's quite often, the enabling technologies, maybe the policies, the motivation, all that kind of stuff, So if you look at it holistically, as opposed to just looking at it as we need to upgrade our IT, well, that's not necessarily the right answer. Yeah. Like, maybe the IT is perfectly good enough. But you've got conflicting motivations and stuff like that between departments and things. So by getting that end-to-end perspective and being able to break it down into sort of manageable chunks is quite powerful.
And would you say across the board, the benefits are very similar or very common from organization to organization? Is there a common driving factor that would you say that for those that hold the purse strings, for those that make the investment decisions, really gets them across the line?
Well, I mean, effectively, you talk to any GM and stuff. I mean, they've got their, they've got their objectives. I mean, either a board of directors or someone is holding their shareholders are holding them accountable for specific, usually financial deliverables. It certainly historically it's moving a little bit more to, maybe there's some things outside of finances, but essentially that's what they're being held accountable for. So unless you can show that what you're doing is going to help them meet those objectives, then you don't really get a lot of their time and whatever, because they'll invest where they think the right solution is. So offering them a framework which allows them to find the right areas, which levers to pull to drive their business in the right direction, and breaking down the way work gets done, which is essentially the process. Showing them how work gets done, because quite often they don't really know, like they know if they give a particular directive or set a particular policy, they know historically that usually makes the business move in this direction. But if you can actually show them the blueprint, and that's where architecture comes in. Yeah. Like I sort of liken it to the, if you were going to build a house or if you were going to do a renovation in a house, if you don't have the blueprint, I've just been doing some renovations in my house. Yeah. So, it's a 40, 50-year-old house. I'm the second owner. And the guy that owned it before me, he actually built it. So every time I rip down a wall, I find interesting electrics and plumbing that I didn't know was there. If I had the blueprint, then I would know exactly what I'm doing. So to me, by getting a process architecture in place and stuff like that, you can lay it down on the table and have the executives look around it and show them how things work. And then you can start measuring and you can start sort of showing the impact of one process on another process and, how overall they produce the value for the customer and ultimately drive those, those metrics and stuff that, that they're being measured on as leaders. So, I mean, I think being able to show how things work as opposed to them just believing how things work, because that's what people are telling them, especially in a functional organization. You've got your finance guys saying one thing, marketing saying another, sales saying another, manufacturing saying another, and you end up just, they just point at each other and it's kind of like, what do you do? So it almost comes down to fact-based management because you can actually show, how work gets done and, how one thing impacts another. And you don't sort of sub-optimize, sales for the, that's causing all sorts of logistics problems. How many times have I seen that in my career? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that about establishing that architecture, that blueprint of the organization. I think it's especially important in the current day and age with so much technology around. It's, I guess, to take your house analogy, it's like you've got one team working on building the garage, completely isolated from the team that's building the kitchen, completely isolated from the team that's building that bedroom or something like that. And they're building all of these different rooms at different levels. Some of them are under the ground, some of them are on top of the ground, some of them are multi-level, some of them are, but without that cohesive sort of end-to-end view or end-to-end perspective, it's not going to be a pretty looking house when they're done with it.
No, and then, and you've got to fit the electrics and the plumbing in as well, which have to service all the different rooms and stuff like that. Yeah. So there's the fundamental architecture, the technical architecture that's driving it all. You have to get that aligned at some point as well. But, I think, just what I've found is for the executives, definitely that being able to show them how their organization works, that's been sort of fundamental. When I talk to end users and workers within the process, I rarely get any pushback from them. I mean, they're usually highly engaged, and to me, I think one of the things that we were talking about earlier was, how do we, what are the benefits of doing this? And to me, by actually adopting a process management approach, the engagement I see in all workers. I mean, I can think of maybe a couple in my career where I've had pushback from people doing the job. No, I've always done it that way. I don't want to change. But most of the time, people are generally frustrated in what they're doing because they don't have the ability to change things. So they just do the bad old process that's been there for 20 years because they don't have any way to change it. But if you actually engage them in the understanding and improvement process, suddenly they become more engaged in their driving because they can see how their work connects to the overall objectives of the organization. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's two levels of engagement here. One is getting permission to do it. But when you actually have the permission and you start working in workshops and stuff like that to work on a project, the workforce themselves, I rarely get any pushback from them. I mean, they're usually highly engaged and, they love it. So, that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And some organizations would dive to technologies like automation, for example, to free up those resources. I mean, you're talking about people doing work that they don't particularly enjoy doing. Well, automation, let's automate everything. And we've seen many organizations do that. But obviously, automation just by itself or automation for automation's sake doesn't always lead us down the path that we thought we were heading.
No, that's right. And, I have a sort of saying for people, just because you can do it doesn't mean to say you should do it. Yeah. Like we can automate, we can digitize, I remember a day, probably only maybe 10 years ago where I would be asked as the CIO, I would be asked, well, let's, can we digitize this? And I would sort of say, well, you could, but it's complex and we'd have to do this fancy integration and stuff. And it's probably going to take a long time and cost a lot of money. And so, the options weren't there. Now there's an infinite number of technical options that you can have. Yeah. Like, there's almost, and that's even without getting to AI and ChatGPT and all the, some of the very latest stuff, but just through, the automation that you were talking about. Yeah. Like automating processes and stuff like that. But I remember, I go way back in my career and I was working in a printing company for City University back in the day, and this was very early in my career. And we actually were tasked with taking a paper-based system. So they had, job cards and stuff like that. And we actually had to build the computer system to do it because there wasn't a package. Yeah. Like, so we had to build it and we were using, the very early days of Oracle and stuff like that. So we had to do the fundamentals of it, and they sent me on a conference, and it was a manufacturing conference that was, all about TQM and Kaizen and a whole load of other, quality initiatives back in the day. But one of the keynotes that stuck with me was a guy called Hal Mather, and he talked about simplification before automation, and that stuck with me all through my career because, again, just because you can do something doesn't mean to say you should. So using process to sort of break down the steps in an end-to-end process, and quite often there's a process that's broken. Well, do you actually need to do that step at all? Like, why don't we just let's get rid of that step and maybe just integrate into the system rather than, have an automation, read a PDF and, translate it into a spreadsheet and then load it into, well, why don't we just integrate? Like there's things there. So if you don't look end to end, you might think you've optimized something because you saved someone some time with an automation thing, but you could have got rid of that step completely if you'd bothered to break it down and whatever. So, again, being able to see it laid out allows you to simplify it. Yeah. So, and then automation is still good. Yeah. Like, that's, I'm not saying not to automate, but don't automate just because you can. Like automate the right things, apply technology in the right areas rather than just across the board where you think it is. Because like I said, these days, if you tried to do all the digital transformations that are out there, you'll never do it. You'll run out of money and run out of time. The goalposts keep moving so fast. So if anything takes more than a year these days, it's probably the wrong thing because you now need to do something different. So
yes.
It can be quite a challenge. So investing in the right technology for the right purpose is really important these days.
Now we've obviously touched on drivers and motivators, but I guess the podcast audience, the people that are listening to this, we'd have some sort of C-level, some CIOs, but I think a lot of process practitioners that are more involved in the process related work. But I guess as a CIO, how do we communicate to the CIO? What language are they using? What are they most concerned about it? Because I guess I should preface that by saying we've got a lot of people working for organizations where it hasn't really been bought into yet when it comes to process management. So it's not really being sponsored. And there's this journey of getting that sponsorship and that buy-in. And most oftentimes it's the CIO that's the obvious option. How do we approach the CIO to get them on board?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the remit of the CIO. I think because again, there's a lot of different types of CIOs. Yeah, but if we sort of take a general, someone who's responsible for the IT operations and development of an organization and security and stuff. Yeah, so it's a pretty broad. It's a pretty broad role these days. But essentially, they're tasked with providing the right technology to support the business objectives. Yeah, like that's ultimately what they're trying to do. And it comes down to that same discussion I was having earlier with the CEOs and general managers and whatever. It's they've got a budget to implement. But I always used to say to my leaders, I said, there's no such thing as an IT project. I mean, there's a business change project which needs IT, but you've got to define the business change project. So, one of the things that if you're talking directly to the CIO, then they will be connected to the business strategy. Yeah. So if you're proposing changes and stuff, it should be driving that strategy, and then the CIO will go to it anyway because it's actually it will be aligned to it. So to me, what the CIO should be doing is adapting to the business strategy. So if you're working inside the business, defining the business problem and the business benefits, then the CIO will sort of follow because it's a natural progression. Yeah, like IT is subservient to business strategy. Yeah, so it's an interesting conversation, but I'm don't talk IT to the CIO, talk business to the CIO, and his job is to translate business to technology and and actually make sure the right stuff's there. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, but I guess I was one of those CIOs that did get processed. So I'm not sure if it's a CIO that doesn't get processed. I don't think. Process is pretty general these days. Most people have a basic understanding of it. It's the adopting it as a strategic tool, I think, which is what we talk about in process management. Yeah, are you using it as a strategic tool in driving your business forward, or are you just using it as a tactical tool? Is it strategic or is it tactical? And there's benefits in using it tactically, but I think what we're trying to talk about here is how do you make it a strategic tool? But again, problems have to be defined in business terms. I mean, other than just upgrades to servers and technical stuff like that, there are no, like I said, there's no IT projects and there's no BPM projects either. There are business change projects which could benefit from technology and process. They're both sort of enablers to this overall business change approach.
Yes, yeah. And would you say it largely, like, whether process management is seen as a strategic tool or a tactical tool, would you say it comes down to the leader in place and how they're sort of driving the organization? Because I have obviously I'm not saying this across the board, but I've heard stories of organizations where they'll have, even a CEO that really understands the concept of process management, and they'll drive the organization through a process centric lens. They'll be there, they'll be at the helm for 5-10 years or so. They'll move on, and even though he's really sort of done a lot to embed a culture of process management and continuous improvement across the organization, they move on, and then all of a sudden process becomes like a dirty word at that organization. And everyone that was on board with the process approach, now they're looking elsewhere for careers and job opportunities, because the organization has changed simply because a leader has changed. How do we make process sustainable?
It's an interesting question, Daniel. And we did some work. When I was back in Mars, we did some work on process maturity, and everyone sort of say, oh, we want to get to 5. Yeah, on the I haven't got it in front of me at the moment, but there's a standard sort of 5 levels of process maturity. I can't remember who published it, but it's a general sort of industry standard, and it was, once you get to level 3, which is, okay, we have processes defined and we're using them to manage day to day, as opposed to, if you got to level 4, well, now we've organized ourselves around process, we don't have a finance department and a sales department, we have process areas and stuff like that. So how do you get from that level 3 to level 4? And we actually decided, I say we, the folks that were working on the process work in Mars, Canada in particular, we basically said, level 3 is probably as far as we're going to get within the organization as it stands at the moment, because what that does, it allows process to be used. So we're using process when we're doing changes and, when we're modifying work and stuff like that. But the organization was never going to get to that level 4. They weren't going to reorganize Canada, it just was never going to be there, because it was part of this. There's an organizational structure in most big organizations, at least, that is really difficult to change because it's come across for years. So you may get to the point where you can't actually drive all the way up to level 4, level 5 of maturity. But level 3 is less dependent, I think, on a single leader, and I think it's more of that sort of culture. And if I go back to I'm still in contact with some of the folks that I used to work with at Mars, and there's still a process mentality within Mars, even though it's not been driven to that sort of, is it a process-driven organization? I mean, it is, but it's not using it in the strategic way that we would look at it. But it's culturally, if they do a project, they automatically bring out their process maps and stuff. Yeah, so they're using it. I don't know. I mean, it's a question is how many organizations would ever get to that full strategic use of process, especially older organizations. I think probably newer organizations can start that way, but for any organization that's been around for any number of years, very difficult to change those organizational boundaries. So it's almost like a matrix thing. You're still going to have the functional sort of control of people and resources, but you can have a process perspective across end to end, the value chain and stuff like that. So there's still ways to sort of get there, but it is tough to actually, to get it from embedded in the culture so that the change in leadership doesn't actually affect it. So, I would say probably level three, if you can embed process thinking into people's day-to-day activities and changes, that will survive changes in leadership.
Yes. That's good. And I think that over the last few years, from what I've seen or what I've observed at least, is the importance of process has been jumping up the priority list because of the disruption that, the pandemic created, disrupted supply chains and many organizations, they had to rethink how they do business, how they deliver value. What do you think now that we've kind of been through that, come out the other side, what do you think the future of business process management looks like?
Yeah, it's good. I think it's going to be shared across organizations now. So I mean, I think there's a lot of, especially if a lot of my experiences in manufacturing and in consumer packaged goods, and the supply chain now it's disintegrated. Yeah, like there's a lot of different players, a lot of different suppliers, and transitions and third-party logistics and hauliers and that kind of stuff. Yeah, to move product from let's say from China to Canada, for instance. I mean, there's a huge supply chain involved there, and whereas we used to just trust that it was going to go from step to step, and we'd send a purchase order and we'd get product. That now there's a drive to getting that visibility to drive down inventory and become more efficient. So the processes are going to cross boundaries now. So we need to understand not just what's within our four walls, but actually we need to understand how the process works from farm to fork or whatever, or whatever, depending on the the industry that you're in, and that will allow technology to help actually sort of enable that and make those supply chains more efficient. And then if you go on the service side, getting user journeys and allowing us to integrate the user experience with the internal processes and stuff like that. So to me, that's, whereas we used to set our services up, the user would experience whatever our process allowed them to experience. Now we can take the user experience and build our processes to drive a better user experience. Yeah. So, that I believe there's a sort of an integration between those two. So, the future, fundamentally, I don't believe the fundamental principles of process management have changed over the years. So, let's not forget what those fundamental principles are, because, they're still fundamental principles. And a lot of the, I think it's like a lot of things. There's a lot of different flavors of, approaches and methodologies and stuff like that. But essentially, there's only one set of principles. So, using those to help organizations still comes down to what the future of BPM is. And I think I think BPM as a program, I'm not so sure I would ever sell BPM as a program. I think I would go in as business improvement and then use all these tools that we've got. And it's probably not just BPM, like there's really good data management stuff going on as well, and business rules and all these different things. How do we apply the right tool to the right problem, as opposed to apply BPM to every problem? It's a toolkit of things, and especially in the smaller organizations, we need to be able to sort of use the right tool in the right situation so that they can actually take advantage of it, because they can't buy the whole toolkit. They haven't got the time or the resource.
Yes, yeah. And I think that when working in a large organization, even in a small organization, if you don't have a full understanding of everyone's background and their perception of what process management is, then you could shoot yourself in the foot by using terminology like BPM, business process management, and then find yourself up against a lot of resistance because they had seen BPM implemented poorly in the past, and decided, no, this doesn't work and this isn't for us. But for the audience that's listening to the episode right now, obviously, we've only been able to kind of scrape the surface on a couple of key points here, but where should they go to learn more about business process management and what it can do for their organization?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I go back to my fundamentals. So, I got into BPM, when I first joined Mars back in '92, I think it was, and I actually attended one of Roger Burlton's training courses back in that day, and it to me, he got it right in the early stages of the fundamentals. The approach to holistic approach to business change. It's not just about process. It's process first, and then other things follow. So I would definitely say, go if you can find Roger and talk to him. That's great. But there's some really good books out there to do that. Because I think he got the fundamentals right in his early work, and he's done some really good work, since as well. But that to me is there's a lot of people I talk to in the process world who still go back to those fundamentals, sort of disciples of Roger, so to speak. I had a really good guy I worked with at Mars, who's now retired, and I don't think he's active in the community, but a guy called Artie Mahal, who he wrote a book called How Work Gets Done. And Artie has this way of taking complex, difficult to explain topics, such as BPM, and he's done a couple of other books as well, and putting them into more sort of mainstream language and stuff like that. So, Artie's book is great. And then, I think it's a matter of, to get into it. And again, it's, learning about it is one thing, but then you've actually got to try it. Yeah. You've got to try it and apply it. And if you can't get buy-in at the senior executive level, there's nothing to say that when you're doing, if you're a BA and you're involved in a project, like there's nothing to say, well, let's have a look at the process, where does it start? Where does it end? What's the system enablers? What are the business rules that are in play? What policies are impacting us? There's nothing to stop you doing that. And actually what I found is where you can't get the top level buy-in, if you start down at that sort of, that level, you can build a groundswell, and then you can explain, you can show the executive, say, look, we did it like this, and I've built process architectures from the ground up. It's nice to do it from the top down, but I built it from the ground up, and you make assumptions about the bits you can't control or you don't have access to. You make assumptions, well, something must be happening over there, so let's call it X. And the bit that you were working on, you can actually do details on. Yeah. So I mean, you just have to. I think you have to do it, and and apply some of those principles in a small scale. And there are benefits to be had from small scale process management as well as the big strategic stuff, because that's tough to get buy into. Yeah, like if you can get it, that's great, and you can actually drive a whole load of change that way. But there's nothing to say you can't start it on a small scale.
Yeah, I agree. And I think oftentimes the larger scale programs or pieces of work come off the back of smaller wins, smaller successes, being able to prove that on an MVP level, on a minimal viable product level, this works and this can deliver value. Let's do it on a wider scale. And I have heard many stories or examples of organizations starting small, getting buy-in, getting wins, and then it doesn't take too long before other areas of the business take notice, and they're like, hey, what are you doing that's working so well? We want to do that as well. So
and include them in some discussion. If you get someone giving you an input, well, include them in a conversation and show them how you're working. And if you're starting from the sort of the ground up, one of the important things is to standardize some very basic, like how are we going to draw a diagram? We don't want 15 different types of diagram, but keep it simple. I mean, there's a lot of really good tools out there now which allow you to do some very good basic, mapping. Don't get carried away with the process management tools at the start. I mean, you can do it in PowerPoint. If PowerPoint is your tool of choice, do it in PowerPoint. But everybody do it in PowerPoint. Everybody use square edge boxes and arrows with a such and such, so that no matter where you go, you're going to see something similar. But so what I do is I usually introduce a mapping standard for organizations, and it's simple enough that they can use it. It doesn't have to be BPMN 2.0 kind of, we've got to have it this shape and we've got to have that arrow and that diamond's got to have the right, like, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Like just start doing it and start using it. So yeah. I mean, the other thing, I was just sort of thinking of a story back in the day. We were going to put in SAP, and everyone was scared of SAP back in the day because I think in the US, Hershey had a big issue with their SAP implementation, and in Canada, one of the big grocery stores had tried to implement SAP and struggled as well. So I remember my CFO coming to me when I was about to lead this project, and she sort of said, "Phil, we got to put in SAP, but don't take the business down while you do it." And I sort of said, "Okay, well, that's good." I wasn't planning on doing that. But what I did is I went back to the leadership team and said, okay, well, let's do the process architecture. Let's understand where SAP is going to impact us and where the changes need to happen, and where do we need to invest in bespoke changes to the system versus just accept what the system does. And so we actually went through that, and it was, I liken it to an insurance policy, like you're about to invest tens of millions of dollars in a big ERP project. Well, how about investing, $50,000 in a bit of process architecture work up front, so that investment is targeted in the right areas and stuff like that. So, that insurance policy is another way to actually get your foot in the door.
No, that's fantastic. That's great. Well, Phil, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me and having this conversation today. It feels like we could go on and on and on. I mean, there's so many different areas of topics that kind of falls within the business process management space. And I've certainly been gleaning a lot and taking some notes myself. And I know the audiences will have taken a lot of value from this conversation as well. So thanks for sitting down with me. It's been an absolute privilege.
Yeah, no problem at all. And, like I said, I just remind people the fundamental principles haven't changed. So, go back to them and apply them, because they are still fundamental principles of business process management. So it's all good. Thanks a lot for it, Daniel.